The firmament seemed to buckle under a profound, frozen sorrow that night, as though the very vault of the atmosphere had finally exhausted its capacity to harbor its own lamentations. From the leaden heights, the snow descended not in delicate flakes, but in heavy, rhythmic pulses, draping the world in a suffocating shroud of white. Across the desolate, stretching plains, the gale composed a haunting melody, a shrill and piercing aria that spiraled through the skeletal remains of splintered fences and whistled past the darkened silhouettes of a settlement that had long since surrendered to a deep, callous slumber. This was a place where the inhabitants had retreated behind their shutters, choosing the warmth of their own indifference over the freezing reality of the world beyond their glass. In the midst of this swirling void, two solitary shapes contested the fury of the elements. They were dark anomalies against the blinding canvas of the storm, moving with a heavy, rhythmic labor that spoke of miles already conquered and spirits nearly spent. Naomi Greyfeather, the elder of the two, moved with a trembling reliance upon a weathered staff, the wood groaning as it bit into the deepening drifts. Her woolen shawl was more than a garment. It was a desperate anchor, a final scrap of the earth she had known before the world had turned its back on her people. Beside her, though often surging slightly ahead to break the wind's first assault, was her daughter, Ishta. Ishta's gaze was a furnace of conflicting passions, a searing mix of prideful defiance and the hollow ache of burgeoning hopelessness. Each breath she exhaled materialized as a fleeting, crystalline cloud, a phantom of life that was immediately torn away and dissolved by the voracious wind. They were wandering ghosts in a territory that refused to acknowledge their presence. Earlier that evening, they had sought the most basic of human mercies. They had moved through the town's narrow arteries, approaching doors that looked sturdy and hearths that promised life. But at every threshold, the response had been a choreographed rejection. Faces would momentarily appear at the panes, curious, perhaps, or merely startled, only to vanish the instant recognition dawned. Curtains were yanked shut with a finality that echoed louder than any spoken word, the fabric acting as a barrier against a conscience the townspeople were unwilling to consult. The hearts of the residents had been cinched tight, reinforced against the otherness that Naomi and Ishta represented. As the snow intensified, it seemed to absorb all sound, transforming the world into a vast, padded cell of silence. Naomi's strength finally faltered. Her knees gave way, and she began to subside into the cold embrace of a drift. Ishta was there instantly, her youthful limbs finding strength she didn't know she possessed as she hoisted her mother back to a vertical position. "Stay with me, mother. Just a little further. We will secure a sanctuary," Ishta murmured, her words trembling not just from the cold, but from the terrifying possibility that she might be lying. She had whispered this mantra a dozen times since sunset, and with each repetition, the syllables felt more like a desperate incantation to the spirits and less like a realistic expectation of the night. Naomi's response was a ghost of a smile, a fleeting expression that seemed to originate from a time and place far removed from this frozen purgatory. "The universe provides according to its own inscrutable will, my child," she wheezed. "Our role is merely to present our need and endure the answer." They reached the perimeter where the town's meager light surrendered to the absolute darkness of the ridge. There, huddled against the rising slope like a stubborn animal, sat a lone cabin. It was a humble structure of timber and stone, nearly invisible against the whiteout conditions, save for the thin, charcoal ribbon of smoke that spiraled from its chimney. To Ishta, that smoke was a dual omen. It was the promise of a burning hearth, but it was also a warning of a potentially hostile occupant. Ishta paused, the wind whipping her hair across her face like a lash. Her extremities were beyond the point of pain, replaced by a dull, terrifying numbness. Yet, the sight of that smoke stirred a primal spark within her chest. Somewhere behind those walls was a living soul. Would they find another closed door, or would this be the one place where the wind didn't follow them? She found she was equally afraid of both outcomes, of the rejection that would kill them, and of the vulnerability that would come with being accepted. When they finally ascended the small porch, the timber groaned under the added weight, a sound like a warning bell in the quiet of the ridge. Behind the frost-etched glass of the window, the amber flicker of a lantern danced. Ishta raised a fist and knocked. It was a gentle sound, easily lost to the gale. There was no response. She steeled herself and hammered again, the sound echoing through the wood and into the marrow of her own bones. For a long, agonizing minute, the only voice was that of the blizzard. Then, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on floorboards signaled an approach. The movement was measured, cautious, and heavy with suspicion. The door groaned on its hinges, opening only a few inches, a sliver of golden light cutting through the gray chaos of the storm. The man who appeared in the gap was a creature of shadow and frost. His eyes were the deep, weathered hue of burnt cedar, reflecting a lifetime of solitude. A thick, unkempt beard, silvered by both age and the ice of the evening, obscured his jaw. He stood with the wary posture of a man who had long ago stopped expecting visitors and had grown comfortable with the silence of the woods. He looked at them, and then through them, his gaze lingering on Naomi's bowed form. Ishta's heart hammered against her ribs. She waited for the click of the latch, for the finality of the bolt. Instead, the man shifted his weight and pulled the door wide. "Step inside before the frost claims what's left of you," he rumbled. His voice was a low vibration, lacking in warmth but possessing a steady, begrudging reliability. The transition was violent. The warmth of the interior hit them with the force of a physical blow, a sensation so intense it felt like a remembered dream. A fire roared in a stone hearth, its flames spitting sparks that danced like gold leaf against the hand-hewn logs of the walls. The air was thick with the scent of seasoned pine and the lingering musk of a lived-in space. The man, whose name was Wappy Carter, moved with a silent, observant grace as Ishta guided her mother to a high-backed chair near the fire. He didn't offer to help with their coats or make empty inquiries about their health. Instead, he simply appeared with a tin pot of coffee, steam rising from it in fragrant, human clouds. He set it down without meeting their eyes, his movements efficient and distant. Naomi's hands, gnarled and translucent like aged parchment, trembled violently as she wrapped them around the warm cup. "You've wandered a significant distance from the reservation boundaries," Wappy said eventually, his voice breaking a silence that had become heavy. "The necessity of departure was forced upon us," Ishta replied, her voice gaining a sandpaper edge of exhaustion. "A contagion swept through our camp. It claimed the young and the old alike. Eventually, there was no one left to perform the burials, and no ground soft enough to take them. We had to move or become part of the silence." She wasn't begging for his pity. Her tone was a flat recitation of fact, as cold and honest as the drifts piling up against his door. Wappy gave a solitary, curt nod, a recognition of the weight of grief, a currency he clearly understood, even if the specifics of her culture were foreign to him. "The storm shows no signs of relenting," he said, turning his back to them to poke at the logs. "You may occupy this space for the night. It is a necessity, nothing more." It was a hollow offering of hospitality, stripped of any pretense of kindness, yet it was the most valuable thing they had been given in weeks. As Wappy worked the fire, the flames cast long, dancing shadows across his features. He looked like a man who had survived many such winters, carving out a life through sheer stubbornness, and who had perhaps lost the ability to fear the cold because he had become a part of it. Ishta observed him through the haze of the firelight. His hands were a map of labor, calloused and scarred. His clothing was a patchwork of repairs, the elbows of his coat reinforced with mismatched fabric. There was a strange duality in his presence, a roughness that spoke of the wilderness, and a subtle gentleness in how he handled the mundane tasks of the home, as if his own strength was something he was constantly trying to temper. Naomi succumbed to a deep, restorative sleep almost immediately, her breathing a rhythmic, shallow whistle that blended with the crackle of the wood. In the sudden quiet of the cabin, Wappy spoke again, his eyes fixed on the embers. "The people down in that valley, they won't offer you a hand," he stated, his voice devoid of judgment. "We are aware," Ishta answered. "Trust is a rare commodity there. They guard it more fiercely than their gold." He looked at her then, a full, direct gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her exhaustion. In the golden glow of the hearth, her eyes shimmered like polished amber buried beneath a layer of fresh snow. For a brief second, the space between them felt thin and charged, a connection of shared isolation. Wappy was the first to break the contact, looking away as if the intensity of the moment had burned him. "Take the cot," he muttered, gesturing toward a small bed in the corner. "I will maintain a vigil by the entrance." Outside, the storm reached a new crescendo of violence, clawing at the logs as if trying to reclaim the heat hidden within. Inside, the passage of time seemed to thicken and slow. Ishta watched the play of the fire and remembered the narratives her father used to share, stories about how the Great Spirit tests a person's worth by placing them in the hands of the unfamiliar. The cabin began to take on a specific character in her mind. It smelled of pitch, ancient smoke, and a third element she couldn't quite identify, the quiet dignity of simply being permitted to exist without apology. She felt a surge of gratitude so profound it was paralyzing. She realized that some thanks are too heavy for words, better expressed in the silence of a shared roof. In the flickering dimness, Wappy leaned his head back against the timber wall. His eyes were closed, but the tension in his jaw suggested he was far from sleep. He was besieged by memories that had no business being awake. The sound of his brother's hacking cough during a winter much like this one, and the slow, agonizing process of his family home becoming an empty shell. He had walled himself off after that, finding peace in the absence of other people's needs. He had convinced himself he was finished with the world, until this night. By the time the first gray light of morning filtered through the frost, the blizzard had transformed the landscape. The cabin was an island in a sea of undulating white, the snow having climbed halfway up the door. Wappy was already moving, reviving the fire and setting water to boil. Ishta rose with a quiet grace, tightening her shawl and preparing to face the day. She stepped out into the biting air to gather clean snow for the water pot. The cold was a sharp, honest pain against her skin, and she found herself welcoming it. It was a reminder that she was still alive. From the window, Wappy watched her. She didn't move like the townswomen. There was a deliberate economy to her motions, a practiced competence that he recognized. When she returned, her face flushed a deep rose by the wind. She set the wooden bucket down and looked up at the ceiling. "The structural integrity of your roof is failing near the chimney," she said without preamble. Wappy blinked, taken aback by the observation. "You have experience with carpentry?" "I was my father's shadow," she replied. "I saw how he braced the timbers against the weight of the mountain snows." Wappy hesitated, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the first crack in his icy exterior. It wasn't much, but it changed the atmosphere of the room. "It seems we both require a distraction from the cabin fever," he conceded. They spent the daylight hours in a partnership of labor. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud of the hammer and the rasp of the saw. They spoke little, but a dialogue formed in the exchange of tools and the shared tension of lifting heavy beams. He would pass her a handful of nails, and she would provide the shingles, their hands occasionally brushing. Each time their skin met, Wappy would recoil slightly, as if startled by a static charge, but his eyes began to linger on her more often. Inside, Naomi remained in a half-dreaming state by the fire. Occasionally, she would murmur in the tongue of her ancestors, words that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves or the sigh of a summer wind. As the sun began its descent, casting long, purple shadows over the drifts, Ishta began to sing. It was a low, melodic chant, a song designed to guide travelers safely through the unseen paths of the spirit world. Wappy paused in his work, leaning against the doorway and pretending to check the horizon. Her voice, thin and fragile at first, grew in resonance until it seemed to saturate the very wood of the cabin, filling the space with an ancient, nameless comfort. That evening, the silence between them had evolved. The sharp edges of suspicion had been worn smooth, replaced by the heavy, shared realization of two people who had spent too long being invisible to the rest of the world. Wappy poured her another cup of coffee, his hand no longer showing any sign of hesitation. "There is no urgency for your departure," he said, his voice softer than before. "The drifts are too high for travel." Ishta nodded, her gaze fixed on the steam. "We will stay only until the paths are clear." Yet, even as the words left her mouth, a silent understanding passed between them. The snow outside was no longer the primary reason they were staying. The days fell into a predictable, comforting cadence. Wappy handled the heavy woodcutting, while Ishta transformed his meager supplies into hearty meals. Naomi, though physically fading, seemed to find a peace she hadn't known in years, her eyes often following the two of them with a soft, knowing luminescence. When Ishta eventually laughed, a bright, clear sound at some small mishap, Wappy stood frozen for a moment. He had forgotten that a human voice could make such a sound inside these walls. In response, he began to leave small tokens of his presence, tiny animals carved from pine scraps left on the table, a careful repair to Naomi's frayed shawl, or a drop of oil on the door hinge so its creak wouldn't disturb their sleep. Ishta saw every gesture. She offered no verbal gratitude, but one morning, Wappy found a delicate braid of willow and colored thread resting near his pillow, a traditional charm meant to bolster the courage of a warrior. He held it for a long time in the pre-dawn light, his fingers tracing the patterns as if they were a map to a place he had forgotten how to reach. However, the peace of the ridge was not entirely insulated from the malice of the valley. A week into their stay, a wandering trader, seeking a shortcut through the foothills, spotted the three of them working outside the cabin. By nightfall, the news had trickled down into the town's tavern. The whispers were jagged and cruel. "That Carter hermit has lost his wits. He's taking in the Red Woman and her kin." The words eventually reached Wappy, carried by the biting wind of gossip. He felt the sting of it, the way small minds attempt to diminish an act of humanity by wrapping it in ugliness. That evening, he was withdrawn, his jaw set in a hard, defensive line. Ishta, sensing the change in the air, watched him from across the hearth. "Do you harbor regrets for opening your door?" she asked quietly. Wappy shook his head, though the movement was tense. "No. I am simply reminded of how poisonous the collective can be when they encounter something they don't understand." She looked at him with a gaze so steady it seemed to ground him. "Let them harbor their darkness. We have the fire. We have the warmth of this roof." Her unwavering calm was a revelation to him. Her certainty acted as a lighthouse in the fog of his own social anxieties. When she reached out and placed her hand over his calloused palm, the world outside, the town, the traders, the judgment, seemed to dissolve into insignificance. Outside, the sky began to weep once more, but the snow fell softly this time, a gentle forgiveness from the heavens. The subsequent days were marked by a deepening quiet. Naomi's health took a final, irreversible turn toward the shadows. Her breathing became a fragile thread, easily snapped. Ishta never left her side, singing the same guiding song every night until her own voice cracked with fatigue. Wappy remained a constant, silent sentinel, ensuring the fire never faltered and the water was always fresh. He said nothing, for he knew that in the face of the great transition, words were merely clutter. One morning, as the first light touched the peaks, Naomi reached out and grasped Wappy's hand. Her skin felt like cool silk. "Guard my daughter," she whispered, her voice a mere vibration in the air. "She is the fire that remains." Then, with a sigh that sounded like a long-awaited release, her fingers went limp. Ishta's grief manifested as a low, guttural cry that seemed to pull the very air from the room. Wappy stepped back, a hollow ache opening in his chest that felt like a physical wound. He felt the terrifying weight of a promise he hadn't known he was ready to make. He buried Naomi on a small, elevated rise overlooking the creek, a spot where the spring sun would first touch the soil and awaken the wildflowers. Ishta stood beside him as the wind tugged at her hair, her face a mask of stoic sorrow. No eulogy was spoken, the land knew its own. When the final stone was placed, she turned to Wappy, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Her journey has reached its destination. She is home." That night, the cabin felt vast and empty. Ishta sat by the hearth, draped in her mother's shawl, staring into the flickering orange heart of the wood. Wappy approached her with a cup of coffee, but she made no move to take it. "You have provided more than I could ever have anticipated," she said, her voice barely audible. "The debt is beyond my ability to repay." Wappy didn't stand. He crouched beside her, his presence a solid, grounding force. "There are no debts here, Ishta. And there is no requirement for you to leave." She lifted her eyes to his, searching for the truth behind the offer. "And if I choose to remain? If I stay in a world that doesn't want me?" Wappy swallowed hard, his own walls finally crumbling into the dust of the past. "Then I will dedicate my life to ensuring that the world never touches you again. I will make sure you never have to knock on another door as long as there is breath in my body." The fire crackled, a sharp punctuation in the silence. Between them, the air was thick with the weight of unspoken vows, promises of protection, companionship, and a love that had been forged in the coldest of nights. Ishta reached out and traced the path of a jagged scar on the back of his hand. As she did, something within Wappy finally broke open, not a rupture of pain, but a blooming of warmth that the hearth could never replicate. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the faint, rhythmic dripping of melting ice, the first herald of a change in the season. Spring was still a distant hope, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. When the final storm of the season eventually arrived, battering the shutters and piling the snow high against the logs, it found the cabin transformed. Laughter now occupied the corners where shadows used to hide. Ishta sang her mother's songs, and Wappy, in his rough, untrained baritone, joined her, their voices weaving together into a tapestry of sound that pushed back the howling void. He pulled her close as the timber frame rattled under the gale's assault. "You are secure here," he murmured against her hair. "I know," she whispered back, looking into his charred cedar eyes. "And for the first time, Wappy Carter, so are you." And in that moment, he realized she was right. The isolation he had cultivated for years had been a prison, not a fortress. When the sun rose the next day, the world was a cathedral of light and silence, pure, white, and seemingly born anew. The footprints of their arrival, the marks of their struggle, and even the path to Naomi's grave had been erased by the night's mercy. Wappy stood at the threshold of the cabin, Ishta by his side, watching as the chimney exhaled a steady plume of smoke into the pale, crystalline sky. He looked down at her hand entwined with his and marveled at the strange architecture of fate. All the pain, the rejection, and the fear he had endured had been the map that led him to this door, this woman, and a sanctuary that no storm could ever hope to extinguish. Perhaps that was the fundamental law of this harsh, beautiful land. It demanded everything of you, stripping away the trivial and the false, until only the most resilient and true aspects of your spirit remained. Inside the cabin, the fire continued to burn with a steady, quiet strength. Outside, the vast expanse of snow began to shimmer with the brilliance of 1,000 suns, reflecting a light that felt very much like hope. If you enjoyed this story, you can show your love and support by subscribing to the Kindness Hour channel, liking, and sharing this video. And if you'd like to see your name featured at the top of our next story, drop your name and country in the comments below.